First off, I want to say this video is inspired by Karsten Rundquist. He did a video where he listed his favorite movie from every year he's been alive, and I'm going to be doing the same thing. Now, I've been on this earth for 22 years. That's a weird way of saying that I'm 22 years old, okay? I know I probably look younger. People always say I look younger. But yeah, 22 years of pain and misery. But you know what doesn't bring me pain and misery? Music. So yeah, let's get into this. This is my favorite album from every year that I've been alive. For 2002, I went with Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots by the Flaming Lips. This album is just such a strange little experience. At times it's blissful, at times it's eccentric, at times it's twisted. But what really strikes me about this album is how much character there is to each musical element. Whether it be the synths, guitars, or drum textures, there's a moment in each of these tracks where it feels like one of these instruments takes on a life of their own. I think the cover art and the title definitely add a lot to that feeling as well. This is one of those albums that genuinely feels like it's from another world, and because of that, it feels extremely timeless. My runner-up for 2002 was Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age. Alright, 2003, I went with Transatlanticism by Death Cab for Cutie. Ben Gibbard is really becoming one of my favorite vocalists ever. I feel like with indie rock, I kind of expect the vocalists to be a bit rough around the edges and maybe not the most technically gifted singer, but Ben Gibbard really defies that expectation. His vocal tone is just so inviting, and he manages to write some of the most singable, memorable, but evocative vocal melodies I've ever heard. Pair that with songwriting that really understands how to pull at the heartstrings without sounding cheesy, and you get an extremely emotional yet replayable album. This also feels extremely ahead of its time. Like, the amount of indie rock from the 2010s that sounds kind of exactly like this is insane. With a lot of these songs being a big part of my life growing up, revisiting this album is just a great trip down memory lane, and it's super nostalgic. Runner-up for this year was Sweet Trip's Velocity Design Comfort. For 2004, I went with Mad Villainy by Madvillain. This still holds up as some of the most clever hip-hop production ever, and you pair that with the king of clever bars, and you get kind of a match made in heaven. It's Kobe and Shaq, it's LeBron and D-Wade, it's KD and Steph. It's two masters at the top of their game bringing the best out of each other. It's not only an extremely important record that embodies the essence of what makes hip-hop great, but it also happens to be extremely fun and not pretentious at all. The runner-up for 2004 is Funeral by Arcade Fire. For 2005, I went with I'm Wide Awake, It's Morning by Bright Eyes. Conor Oberst is kind of an enigma. His vocal delivery definitely won't be for everyone, and some may even find it annoying or uncomfortable, but to me it comes across as extremely honest and authentic. His quivering delivery gives the sense that he's on the edge of breaking down at any second, and while this vocal styling isn't necessarily a new thing, I think Conor's approach to it is certainly one of the most striking and believable that I've heard. This album isn't always gonna blow you away instrumentally, but there's enough chemistry between Conor and the band to make his stellar writing hit home. Some standouts for me are Lua, First Day of My Life, and Poison Oak. The runner-up for this year was Sufjan Stevens' Illinois. Alright, 2006, I went with Donuts by J Dilla. I mean, what could I say? I'm a sucker for fantastic sample work, and this album is exactly that. This record was pivotal in shaping how I view sampling. Before listening to this, I had the ignorant belief that sampling had to be complicated and entirely transform the source material for it to be a good sample. And Dilla's work here is kind of the antithesis to that. A lot of these samples are very simple and actually don't do that much in terms of transforming the original song. While there is still traditional sampling techniques on this album that are in no way easy to execute, I think the main skill on display here is Dilla's taste and intuition to choose samples that work together to create something that just feels right. Dilla is essentially taking a wide variety of styles of music from many different decades and many different genres and crafting something that feels unique to him and like it was meant to exist. While sampling can be easy to write off as lazy, it's albums like this that solidify the indescribable sense of magic that great sampling can evoke. My runner-up for 2006 was Back to Black by Amy Winehouse. I know, it's kind of an obvious pick. You probably expected this. But yeah, I think this is Radiohead's best album. I flip back and forth between OK Computer and this all the time. I just think how visceral and groovy and intricate this album is and how colorful it is really makes me love it. The riffs are insanely catchy, and it's got some of my favorite York vocal performances as well. While it's not their most like experimental album, I think it is their best display of tight performances that just get under your skin. You have the hauntingly beautiful Nude that offers one of the best Thom Yorke vocal performances ever. You have insanely intricate grooves like 15 Step and beautifully progressive two-parter tracks like Weird Fishes / Arpeggi. My runner-up for 2007 was Kala by MIA. For 2008, I went with Ear Food by Roy Hargrove. Now, I don't see many people talking about this album, and you probably wouldn't expect to see a jazz album on this list, especially in the year 2008. But I don't know, I've really grown to love this thing. While it might not be the most adventurous or difficult jazz record, it is the one that I come back to the most. The performances on here are just stellar, the piano and the trumpet often being the standouts. There's a clarity to the mixes here that feels really refined and luxurious, and the variety of moods, tempos, and grooves keeps the track list fresh. From the very first track, this album just pulls me in, and it's really rare that I don't listen to this album start to finish. The runner-up for 2008 was Lost Wisdom by Mount Eerie. Alright, 2009, I went with Vectimist by Grizzly Bear. This album operates in a genre that often can feel underwhelming for me, especially some of the more generic indie acts of the late 2000s. And while it does feel like it exists kind of in the same space as your Alt-J's and your Arctic Monkeys, it completely blows these bands out of the water. The sheer size of the tracks on this album is something to behold, with the densely layered vocal harmonies, roomy drums, and reverbed guitars. There's really a lot going on in these tracks. The best description I can really give this is Fleet Foxes meets Midair Thief. The runner-up for this year was another Mount Eerie album, Wind's Poem. 2010, the year of Kanye's grand and iconic My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, but the actual best album of the year comes from this silly little white guy, James Murphy. I feel like it's rare that you get a dance album with this much personality and humor. Murphy's writing is consistently witty, tongue-in-cheek, and a little unserious. While some may see this album as repetitive, it's actually some of the most effective repetition I've heard because of how that repetition builds and layers on itself. You also get somewhat of a rock essence here as well, not only because the drum sounds are more rock than electronic, but because the synth passages kind of serve as somewhat of a guitar solo themselves, with the foundations of most of these tracks being laid by a consistent drum pattern, synth chords, and bass line. It gives free rein for these synths to kind of just riff on top. As a result, you get some of the most memorable synth passages in recent memory, like the synth on Dance Yourself Clean, which is an insanely huge and crunchy synth, or the off-kilter synth at the end of All I Want. Even with all the influence LCD Soundsystem continues to have even today, The Dare, I'm looking at you, this album stands alone as a really unique piece of dance rock fusion. And of course, the runner-up for this year is My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West. Alright, 2011, I went with Replica by 1-0-Tricks Point Never. There's something extremely lonely, cold, and brittle about this album. The sampling is abstract, glitchy, and off-kilter, and while it sometimes gives similar vibes to Tim Hecker's music, the vocal sampling is what really makes it different for me. The vocal manipulation works to create sounds that don't even really feel human. It kind of feels post-apocalyptic in a way. It's kind of like the last memories of humanity are trying to push through the noise and obstruction, but ultimately they end up being buried in a cold, harsh, and unrelenting atmosphere. My runner-up for 2011 was Helplessness Blues by Fleet Foxes. Yeah, Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar. I mean, it had to be here. I mean, simply put, this is a story about growing up in Compton and the effect that this environment had on Kendrick. I just love how specific and personal this album is as well. Kendrick could have easily made these stories more vague to make it more relatable, but he doesn't. As Kendrick continues to solidify himself as one of the greatest rappers ever, it's a treat to have an album like this to look back on, to really see where he came from. And of course, you just have so many iconic moments on this album. Promise that you will sing about me. Pray my dick get big as the Eiffel Tower. I think it's also important to point out just how influential this album is. While it might not be his magnum opus, it's not as good as TPAB, I think it actually has more influence than TPAB, especially in the conscious hip-hop lane. My runner-up for 2012 was The Seer by Swans. Alright, for 2013, I went with Doris by Earl Sweatshirt. Now, I have to admit, this is a pretty weak year for music, but I also feel like I have a lot of big blind spots. I haven't heard Sunbather, I haven't heard Like Clockwork, and I haven't heard Random Access Memories. I mean, if I have to talk about Doris, I will say it is my favorite Earl Sweatshirt album. People often say that some rap songs is their favorite. That one's grown on me a little bit, but I think just the features on this album are really great. There's a lot of fantastic production here. I feel like it's Earl's most varied and diverse album as well. I also really like how raw and hungry this project feels, even though the flows and the beats are generally pretty chill. Don't get me wrong, this isn't like my favorite album ever, and I wouldn't even say that I love it, but if I had to choose for 2013, it would be, yeah, Doris by Earl Sweatshirt. Runner-up for this year would be Run the Jewels 1 or Government Plates by Death Grips. I've talked about this album a lot, so I don't want to go too into detail, but of course, To Be Kind by Swans. I think this is still the best album that they've made. That's not a hot take or anything, but I mean, just the sheer size of these songs is insane. I think it's got Michael Gira's most unhinged vocal performances and some of the most visceral kind of riffs and grooves that they've ever done. I mean, with Swan stuff, you're going to get a lot of disturbing kind of visceral primalistic lyrics, and there's no shortage of that here. It's one of those albums that I don't listen to that often because it's such a big undertaking. I mean, it's 2 hours long, but when I do listen to it, it hits me every time just how otherworldly, how massive, and how transcendental this thing is. Runner-up for this year would be Who Will Cut Our Hair When We're Gone by The Unicorns. And another one that I feel like I don't have to talk too much about, this is TPAB, To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. It's his magnum opus. It's his most fun record, in my opinion. That might be crazy to say because a lot of the subject matter here is really serious, but I think Kendrick approaches these ideas and these themes with a lot of personality, a lot of energy, and a lot of eccentricities. The production on here is absolutely one of a kind. You've had so many people try to imitate this album in terms of jazz rap, and often it just doesn't hit as hard as this album. Some just absolutely excellent instrumental inclusions from Thundercat, of course. The narrative running throughout the entire thing, the themes all kind of tie together and all make themselves known as we approach the last track and as we get that full poem on Mortal Man. It's also got some of Kendrick's most emotional performances ever, like The Blacker the Berry. Kendrick does such an elite job here of just channeling that emotion and almost kind of being like an actor. These performances are very cinematic, they're very theatrical, but they're all based in something that feels very raw and real and human. My runner-up for 2015 was At Long Last ASAP by A$AP Rocky. Alright, 2016, we have Blonde by Frank Ocean. You guys probably saw this coming. This was the album that got me into music. This is the album that made me love music. I still remember vividly listening to this thing for the first time. I mean, it's just a beautifully intimate, personal, heartfelt, complex and complicated, stripped back at times, but also extremely layered and dense at times. This is Frank Ocean really at the top of his game, just understanding how to create extremely evocative and emotive tracks. I've really yet to find an album with production as unique as this as well. I feel like that's not talked about often enough. While yes, a lot of the time you do just have like stripped back guitars, I think some of the percussion elements, just how Frank Ocean's vocals are treated at times is really unique. You see artists like Brockhampton, for example, taking inspiration from Frank Ocean in terms of those pitched up vocals, but I feel like the way that Frank Ocean does it here, it feels so individualistic. You got some of the most beautiful songs ever like Siegfried and Ivy. You have the iconic Nights beat switch, and then you have Frank just really showing off his vocal chops on a track like Godspeed or a track like Solo. As the years go on, I'm not as emotionally connected to this album as I used to be, but it still holds up as one of my favorite albums of all time. I got two runner-ups for this year, David Bowie's Black Star and Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition. We have another album here that played a very big part in me just getting into music and me loving it. This is Saturation 2 by Brockhampton. Now, I flip back and forth in my head all the time about which Saturation I think is the best. Sometimes I prefer the production on 3, sometimes I prefer the simplicity of 1, but I think overall the catchiness and just how iconic Saturation 2 is what really brings it over the top for me. The chemistry between all the members here is something to behold. You get some of the most fun Brockhampton tracks ever. You got Sweet, you got Gummy, some really underrated tracks like Chick and Fight. Of course, the unnerving and very honest Junkie. If Saturation 1 was Brockhampton getting their name out there, Saturation 2 is when I feel like they really hit like a cult fan base kind of status. Runner-ups for this year, other than the other 2 Saturations, are Process by Sampha and Forever is a Mighty Long Time by Big Crit. Alright, 2018, I went with Slide by George Clanton. Vaporwave legend, George Clanton. Unlike his most recent album, this places more of an emphasis on individual elements of the tracks, I feel like, whether that be like a strange synth line, a heavy drum beat, or a distorted bass line. I mean, you're still getting that kind of 90s nostalgic feel, and the production is still fantastic. It's still dense and lush. It's pretty different from Ooh Rappa Yeah, but just as fantastic. My runner-up for this year would be Kids See Ghosts and Time and Place by Caro Caro Bonito. Alright, 2019, I went with Titanic Rising by Wise Blood. This was one of my first like art pop or chamber pop albums, and I think it still holds up as one of my favorites. The songwriting here is just so well thought out and patient and deliberate. I feel like the cover of this album does a lot in kind of enhancing the music here, kind of places you in that mystical kind of underwater enchanting world. But yeah, the production here is just fantastic. It has kind of an old school feel to it. It's got a really good balance between feeling acoustic and homey and kind of rustic, but also really expansive at the same time. I love singing along to this thing. I feel like it's just so catchy and so memorable in terms of the vocal melodies. And there's a lot of variation here too. You get a lot of synth-based stuff, but you get a lot of piano stuff as well, some strings. Instrumentally, there's a lot of variety, but it all feels cohesive at the same time. My runner-ups for this year were Freddie Gibbs and Madlib's Bandana and Tyler, the Creator's Igor. Alright, this is one of my few 10 out of 10s. This is Windswept at Dawn by Ichiko Aoba. This album is just so delicate and gentle. The vocals are consistently enchanting, and just the atmosphere of this thing is really unique. This whole album feels like being gently put to sleep in the best way possible. Ichiko Aoba's guitar work on here is actually like stellar. Her vocal tone is so unique. It's very high, it's very innocent, and just really, really pretty. I feel like this album is still to this day one of the prettiest albums that I've ever heard. It's very quiet at times. There's a lot of space here. There's not really anything that hits you in the face or that's gonna like sweep you off your feet. But where the beauty comes from is really in the details, really in how the guitar is being played, or how the piano is being played, or how she's beautifully sliding from one note to another, or crafting these beautifully intricate melodies. It's folky, but it also has a lot of jazz elements to it, I feel like, in terms of just like the melodic and harmonic and chordal content. And I have to mention Parfume de Toi, one of the most beautiful piano pieces I feel like I've ever heard in my life. So yeah, this thing's fantastic. Please check it out if you haven't. 2 runner-ups for this year, Songs by Adrian Lenker and How I'm Feeling Now by Charlie XCX. Alright, 2021. Sometimes I Might Be Introvert by Little Simz. Little Simz, not only one of the best female rappers right now, one of the best rappers in general. Her pen game is absolutely unmatched. Her delivery, her confidence, her charisma is so just infectious and fun to listen to. This is kind of her most grand and I feel like conceptual albums. A lot of the instrumentation is very theatrical, a lot of strings, a lot of orchestration, and a lot of kind of regal sounding instruments. When you pair that huge instrumentation and that very theatrical styling with a lot of personal writing, and it makes for a really interesting contrast. I mean, it's just some of the best writing of the year, some of the best production of the year, and I think it's going to continue to hold up as kind of a classic. Runner-up for this year was For the First Time by Black Country New Road. Speaking of Black Country New Road, my pick for 2022 was Ants from Up There. I feel like there's kind of 3 stages of my music listening journey, and I feel like this is the 3rd stage. First stage would be me like loving Drake and like Juice WRLD when I was like 16. Stage 2 would be like Frank Ocean, Brockhampton, Kendrick Lamar. And then this would be stage 3, really getting thrown into being like a kind of pretentious music nerd. This thing's fantastic. Isaac is one of the most unique writers, or he was. Sucks to see him go. One of the most emotional and unfiltered performers as well. You're getting a lot of very heartfelt and honest and unfiltered vocal performances with some stuff that you would technically describe as bad, but as long as you can sell that emotion and as long as you lean into that, I feel like it works, and Isaac does exactly that. I also just need to point out how masterful this album is instrumentally. You can really feel that every member of this band has a really good understanding of just like music theory, and while that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be a good album just because you know some music theory, Jacob Collier, but this band just knows how to make a song grow, how to play with tension and release. The pacing of this album is insane. I mean, the last track on this thing is like 12 minutes long. It's got like 3 parts to it. It all just comes together in such a harmonious and powerful experience. A lot of this album is very depressing lyrically, but it also feels kind of freeing in a way. It's really a cathartic experience, and there's a reason that I weeped to this thing, that I cried to this thing on my first reaction. It's a lyricist, a vocalist at the top of his game, and he's paired with a bunch of musicians at the top of their game as well. My runner-up for this year was De Todas las Flores by Natalia Lafourcade. Hopefully I said that right.
Since I was born, I've heard the voice of the Father.
And the last year here, 2023, I went with 3D Country by Geese. You guys probably saw this coming. I named this as my favorite album in my yearly recap. Yeah, I mean, this is just another stellar vocalist. Cameron Winter is so fun to listen to. He's actually like such an insanely impressive vocalist in terms of his range and just the amount of color and personality he can bring to these vocal performances. There's a lot of 70s influence here, a lot of like blues rock kind of influence, but it's also kind of quirky in a way and kind of weird and strange and unsettling, and it feels very modern as well. Yeah, I continue to love this thing. It's super groovy, insanely catchy, and the performances are just insanely tight. My runner-up for this year was Saved by Reverend Kristen Michael Hayter. And 2024? Who knows? I guess you'll have to wait and see until the end of the year. Let me know your thoughts on these albums down below. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.